There is a manuscript in the library of the Daga Estifanos monastery on a small island in Lake Tana in the Highlands of northern Ethiopia. It is written in Ge'ez, the liturgical language of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church. The pages are vellum, the ink is iron gall, the book is approximately 25 centimeters tall and runs to 108 chapters. It is called the Book of Enoch. In Ethiopia, this text never stopped being scripture. The monks copy it by hand and have been copying it without interruption since at least the 6th century CE. The rest of the Christian world forgot this book existed. For roughly 1,400 years, Western theologians treated it as lost. It was sealed away, not by accident but by canonical decision, in the 4th and 5th centuries CE. What it contains, and what a Scottish traveller named James Bruce found when he carried 3 copies of it out of the Ethiopian Highlands in 1773, is one of the strangest and most under-discussed stories in the history of ancient religious texts. The manuscript Bruce carried out is not unique. Copies exist in the Bodleian Library at Oxford, in the British Library, and in Ethiopian monastery libraries, some still uncatalogued. The standard scholarly edition was edited by Michael Knibb and published by Oxford University Press in 1978. The book in its Ethiopic form dates to the medieval period, but the text it preserves is much older. Fragments of the same composition, written in Aramaic, were recovered from the caves at Qumran in the 1940s and 50s. Those fragments have been dated paleographically to approximately 200 BCE. The text itself is older still. If you find that the academic literature on texts like this has been incomplete, if you suspect there are records still sitting in monastery libraries waiting for someone to read them differently, this channel is for that work. Subscribe only if that is the question you have been looking for. The rest of us continue. Mainstream biblical scholarship treats the Book of Enoch as a Jewish apocalyptic composition, produced in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, in the Second Temple period. The standard authorities are R. H. Charles, the Oxford scholar who produced the definitive English translation in 1893 and again in 1912, and more recently George Nicholsburg of the University of Iowa and James Vanderkam of Notre Dame. In their reading, Enoch is a pseudepigraphical work, meaning it was written under the name of an ancient figure but composed many centuries later. Its purpose, in the mainstream account, is theological. It explains the origin of evil through the myth of the fallen watchers. Its narrative of beings descending from the sky is allegory. Nothing more is required. The break in this reading came in 1976 with the publication of Zecharia Sitchin's first book, The 12th Planet. Sitchin was not a theologian. He was a Russian-born, London-educated economist who read ancient Hebrew, Akkadian and Sumerian. He spent decades reading the cuneiform tablets in the British Museum's collection and the Babylonian sections of museums across Europe and the Near East. His credentials in the source languages were real. His argument about Enoch was simple and specific. The watchers of first Enoch, the beings the text calls in Aramaic the Irin, meaning the wakeful ones, who descend from heaven, take human wives, and teach humanity metallurgy, astronomy, pharmacology, and the working of metals, are the same beings the Sumerian tablets call the Anunnaki. The two traditions are not parallel myths developed independently. They are, in his reading, two surviving records of the same event, preserved in two different scribal cultures separated by roughly 1,500 kilometers and several centuries. Sitchin pointed to specific correspondences. The catalogue of forbidden knowledge taught by the Watchers in Enoch matches the catalogue of divine prerogatives, the powers of civilization itself, that Sumerian texts attribute to the Anunnaki. What Sitchin's reading implies, if it holds, is that the Book of Enoch preserves a memory older than Judaism, older than the Hebrew language, older than the Temple at Jerusalem. The text would be, in that case, an Aramaic translation of an oral or written tradition, reaching back into the 3rd millennium BCE, into the same period that produced the Sumerian king list and the early versions of the Atrahasis epic. The Atrahasis tablets are housed in the British Museum and at Yale. They describe the Anunnaki, a council of deities, creating humanity to perform labour on earth. The Sumerian king list, held at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, lists 8 antediluvian kings, reigning for a combined 241,200 years before a great flood. The pattern is identical to the pattern in Enoch and in the early chapters of Genesis. Beings descend, they mix with humanity, There is a flood. The line of long-lived patriarchs is cut short. If the Sitchin reading is correct, if Enoch and the Sumerian tablets are two records of the same event, then several conventional assumptions become difficult. The first is that the Genesis flood narrative is a localized Hebrew theological invention. It is not. It is a survival of a much older Mesopotamian record, and Enoch preserves the longer version that Genesis compresses. The second assumption that breaks is the assumption that the figures called the Anunnaki are mythological. The cuneiform record is consistent. The Enochic record is consistent. The Sumerian texts give astronomical anchoring. The Enochic texts give names, hierarchies, and specific knowledge transferred. If you want to check this yourself, the Atrahasis translation by Stephanie Daly is in print from Oxford University Press, and the Ethiopic Enoch in Michael Knibb's edition is in any major university library. The third revision is harder. It involves the timeline of human civilization. The conventional model places the agricultural revolution at approximately 10,000 BCE and the first cities at approximately 4,000 BCE. The texts under discussion describe knowledge transfer happening before the flood, and the flood in these traditions is the boundary event of human history. The mainstream academic response to Sitchin's Enoch and Anunnaki argument was essentially silence followed by dismissal. There is no peer-reviewed paper that engages with the specific correspondences he identified. There is no published linguistic analysis comparing the Aramaic Erin to the Sumerian Anunna with the goal of testing his claim. The response in scholarly journals has been to characterize Sitchin as a pseudo-archaeologist and to leave the specific philological correspondences unaddressed. This is the asymmetry the careful viewer needs to see clearly. Refutation requires engaging with specific claims. Dismissal requires only a characterization. No counter-translation has been published showing that the Watcher's catalogue of taught knowledge in 1 Enoch chapter 8 differs in a meaningful way from the Sumerian catalogue of divine prerogatives. No academic Assyriologist has published a paper arguing that the names of the Watchers cannot be cognate with the names of the Anunnaki. The argument has been declared fringe without being engaged. R. H. Charles, the standard 19th century translator, never addressed Sumerian parallels at all. He could not have, since the major Anunnaki texts were not translated in his lifetime. James Vanderkam and George Nicholsberg, the leading living scholars, treat the Watcher's narrative as Jewish apocalyptic literature responding to Greek influence, a reading that does not need to account for Mesopotamian parallels because, in their methodology, those parallels are not the relevant context. This is not bad scholarship. It is scholarship that has decided in advance what context counts. The question Sitchin raised about whether a different context is also relevant has not been answered seriously. It has been waved away. To understand why the Ethiopian monks kept this book when everyone else let it go, you have to understand where they kept it. Lake Tana sits in the highlands of northern Ethiopia, at an elevation of approximately 1,780 meters. It is the source of the Blue Nile. On its islands and along its shores are some of the oldest continuously operating monasteries in the Christian world. Daga Estifanos, Tana Kirkos, Kebran Gabriel, Ura Kidana Mihret. Many were founded between the 14th and 16th centuries CE, but the monastic tradition itself in Ethiopia reaches back to the 4th century, to the conversion of the kingdom of Aksum under King Azana in approximately 330 CE. Aksum was, at that point, one of the 4 great powers of the ancient world. The teacher Mani, writing in the 3rd century, listed Aksum alongside Rome, Persia, and China. When Christianity reached Aksum, it did not arrive through Rome. It arrived through Syria and Egypt, in a stream that carried with it texts the later Roman and Byzantine canonical decisions would exclude. One of those texts was 1 Enoch. The Ethiopian Church kept it, the Roman Church dropped it, the Byzantine Church dropped it. By the 8th century, no copy of 1 Enoch in any language was known to exist anywhere in the Mediterranean world. The book was, for all practical purposes, gone. It survived only in Gez, only in Ethiopia, only because the monks of Lake Tana and the Highlands kept copying it. The monastery scriptoriums were not heated. The vellum was prepared from goatskin. The ink was made from oak galls and iron sulfate. A single complete manuscript of Enoch might take a scribe 2 years to produce. The books were stored in goatskin satchels, hung on wooden pegs in the manuscript rooms, locked behind doors that opened only for the abbot. When James Bruce arrived at the court of the emperor in Gondar, the Highland capital, in 1770, he asked specifically for this book. He had read about it in Syncellus, the 9th century Byzantine chronicler who had quoted small fragments from a Greek copy now lost. Bruce knew the book was there. He waited 2 years to gain access. The 3 Guise manuscripts he eventually carried back to Europe in 1773 are now in the Bodleian Library at Oxford and in Paris. The first English translation, by Richard Lawrence, was published in 1821. R. H. Charles produced the definitive scholarly edition in 1893. In the meantime, beginning in the 1840s, the British Museum began to translate the Sumerian and Akkadian cuneiform tablets that had been excavated by Henry Layard and Hormuzd Rassam from the mounds at Nineveh and Nimrud. By the early 20th century, both bodies of literature were available in European languages for the first time. The parallels were noticed almost immediately by some readers. They were not pursued by the academic mainstream. The parallel that mainstream scholarship has been most reluctant to address is not Sumerian. It is South Asian. The Vedic literature, specifically the Rig Veda, compiled in northwestern India in approximately the 2nd millennium BCE, contains its own account of beings called the Asuras, who in the oldest layer of the text descend from the sky, intermarry with humans, and teach the arts of civilization. The Rig Veda survives in oral tradition, transmitted for more than 3,000 years before being written down. It is one of the oldest religious compositions in any Indo-European language. The names of the elder Asuras, Varuna, Mitra, the 7 Aditya, share linguistic features with the Iranian Ahuras, and more distantly, with the divine councils of the Mesopotamian Anunnaki. The specific point of correspondence is the catalogue. The Watchers of Enoch teach forbidden knowledge in Chapter 8, metallurgy, astronomy, the making of weapons, the use of cosmetics, the reading of signs in the heavens. The Asuras transmit in the Vedic account the corresponding skills. The Anunnaki, in the cuneiform record, hold the prerogatives of civilization listed by category. The 3 catalogues, separately preserved in 3 different scribal cultures, describe the same knowledge transfer event. The mainstream account is that this is diffusion, or shared Indo-European inheritance. The difficulty with the diffusion account is that the Sumerian record is not Indo-European at all. Sumerian is a language isolate. It has no known relatives. Diffusion does not account for the specific correspondences. They are still on the table, they are still uninvestigated. The strongest counter-argument to the Sitchin reading is also the most patient one. The argument is that all 3 traditions, Sumerian, Hebrew and Enochic, and Vedic, share a common substrate of ancient Near Eastern mythology that diffused through trade and conquest over thousands of years, and that the correspondences are real but explainable without any extraordinary claim. The scholar who has made this argument most carefully is Stephanie Daly of Oxford, whose book Myths from Mesopotamia traces specific Sumerian motifs through Akkadian, Hebrew, and Greek literature. Her account is meticulous. It is also incomplete. It accounts for the diffusion of stories. It does not account for the specific philological catalogues that map across the 3 cultures. Whether her diffusion model can be extended to cover the catalogues, whether such an extension would predict the specific names and skills found in Enoch chapter 8, remains genuinely unresolved. If the Watchers of Enoch and the Anunnaki of the Sumerian tablets are records of the same event preserved in 2 scribal traditions, then the standard timeline of religious and intellectual history requires substantial revision. The Book of Enoch is not late apocalyptic fiction. It is a survival, and what it survived to record has not been seriously refuted. The Book of Enoch is in the monastery libraries of Lake Tana. It is in the Bodleian Library at Oxford, in the manuscripts James Bruce carried out of Ethiopia in 1773. It is in the standard scholarly edition produced by Michael Knibb at Oxford University Press in 1978. The Aramaic fragments are in the Israel Museum's Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem, recovered from the caves at Qumran in the 1940s and 50s. Zecharia Sitchin's argument was published in the 12th Planet in 1976. It has not been refuted on the specific philological correspondences he identified. It has been characterized as fringe. That is not the same thing. What the Ethiopian monks knew when they kept copying this book, through the centuries when no one else in the Christian world could read it, through the centuries when no one else in the Christian world remembered it existed, is still open. It has been open since the 7th century, when the last Western copies disappeared. It is still open now.